So the World War II camp, it's clearly an enormous space, and we've got one little part of that. What is different to the 1982 camp is that it's a place of living. It's an habitational space. And the 1943 map gives a full outline of where the buildings are, but it doesn't really tell you what those buildings are. So what we've been able to do in this project is start to get a clearer sense of how that camp works, where they're washing, where they're living, where the stables are situated, that sort of communal space and that sense really of the life of the camp starting to come to light in a much clearer picture. In terms of the 1982 stuff, well, it's a very different sort of place.
And I think that's something where the aerial photography, the drone survey, really came into its own. It offered real value. So when we look at the AP, you can actually see some of the features clearly in the photography. So you can actually make out and identify individual buildings. Some of those are more are clearer than others. Some of them are kind of more ephemeral, but some are missing. In terms of the 1982 layer, the site is almost reorientated. So in 1943, the kind of regimental headquarters, everything was on the seafront, and the lines of communication, the copper wire that we identified, and the way the buildings are organised, spatially laid out, kind of run backwards. For the Argentinian occupation, you can actually pivot that because the threat, or the perceived threat, well, for them wasn't coming from the seafront, it was actually coming from Mount Longdon. It was coming from Two Sisters, it was coming from Mount Kent. When the British task force that was coming to liberate the area, that was the direction that they were travelling. So the Argentinian landscape was reorientated, and actually we see evidence of that in terms of the way sentries are posted, in terms of the way the guns are positioned, but also in terms of the way the comms wire actually runs back through the site to the command and control centres located near the Moody Brook Road.
So the camp only lasts about 18 months. By March 1944, most of the troops are repatriated back to the UK. So the question then is, what happens to all of the buildings? And, well, it's one of those intriguing scenarios that actually they get translocated back into Stanley, reused in other parts of daily life. And a number of the Nissen huts, that's those sort of huts with the half-moon shaped roofs, you can see them all over different parts of Stanley, and no doubt other facets of this camp have found their way into other buildings.
Another fascinating dimension to this is the reuse of the foundations of 1943 buildings by the 1982 Argentinians. The stables in particular, there was a lot of Argentinian activity around there, and they were using the deep foundations, terraced foundations, in order to actually reinforce their bunkers in a way that tells us something about the quality of the workmanship back in 1942, that these things were still solid. And actually, in terms of protection, the Argentinians were thinking, I'm going to put my foxhole here rather than somewhere else. So that's an interesting dimension in terms of the reuse of that landscape and those buildings, that architecture, by a future force.